3:14 a.m. Strait of Hormuz, westbound transit lane, 16 nautical miles east of the Iranian coast. Iranian naval units just moved into a blocking formation directly across the path of a U.S. Navy guided missile destroyer. 6 vessels, stationary, lights on, deliberately positioned in a line across the deepwater channel. The USS Bainbridge had 4 minutes before it would be forced to stop or collide with vessels that were not moving. U.S. Command ordered an immediate maneuver. Welcome to Navy Strikeforce. Today, we're going inside the 134 minutes that followed that blocking contact. 134 minutes in which a calculated Iranian obstruction operation, a high-speed U.S. naval maneuver executed with feet to spare, and a layered response combining surface action with carrier aviation reshaped the tactical picture in the most contested maritime corridor on the planet. This is what it actually looks like when the U.S. Navy refuses to be stopped in the Strait of Hormuz, and why the maneuver the Bainbridge executed that morning was more strategically significant than anything she could have fired. To understand what made the Iranian blocking operation at 3:14 a.m. different from previous obstruction attempts in the Strait, you need to understand the specific geometry of that location in the channel. 16 nautical miles east of the Iranian coast, the Strait of Hormuz narrows to one of its most constrained points for westbound transit traffic. The deepwater channel, the lane where a vessel with the Bainbridge's 9.9-meter draft must operate to maintain safe keel clearance, is approximately 1.8 nautical miles wide at this position. To the north, Iranian territorial waters, with the legal boundary beginning 2.3 nautical miles from where the Iranian blocking line had been established. To the south, a shoaling zone where water depth drops below 14 meters within 800 meters of the channel edge. Insufficient depth for the Bainbridge to navigate without a serious grounding risk. 6 Iranian vessels positioned across 1.8 nautical miles of navigable water filled the available channel completely. The Bainbridge could not go north without entering Iranian territorial waters, which would hand Tehran a diplomatic and legal weapon more powerful than any physical one. She could not go south without risking grounding in shallow water that would strand a 9,200-ton warship in the most visible possible location in the world's most watched waterway. And she could not continue west at current speed without driving into stationary vessels within minutes. This was not an accident of positioning. The 6 Iranian vessels had been placed with a geometric precision that required prior knowledge, detailed, specific knowledge, of the deepwater lane's exact width at that point, the precise location of the southern shoaling boundary, and the distance to Iranian territorial water on the northern side. Iran had done its homework. The Bainbridge had been tracking the 6 contacts for 18 minutes prior to the blocking line being formally established. During those 18 minutes, the vessels had been operating in a loose patrol pattern along the northern edge of the transit lane, close enough to observe, ambiguous enough in their individual positions that the Bainbridge's watch team had not elevated them to a coordinated threat classification. They looked like patrol. They were surveillance and positioning. The classification changed at 3:14 a.m. when all 6 vessels simultaneously maneuvered to their blocking positions and stopped simultaneously. 6 separate vessels, 1 command, 1 moment. The watch officer had the contact reclassified, and the commanding officer called to the bridge in 80 seconds. The commanding officer assessed the picture in the time it took him to cross the bridge to the navigation display. Blocking line established. Channel filled across its entire navigable width. Territorial water boundary 2.3 nautical miles to the north. Shoaling water 800 meters to the south. The Bainbridge making 14 knots. Time to forced stop if no action was taken. 4 minutes and 20 seconds. He had the navigator begin generating the maneuver solution before he picked up the radio handset. The warning broadcast went out on channel 16 at 3:16 a.m., 2 minutes after the blocking line was established. The Bainbridge identified herself as a U.S. Navy warship conducting innocent passage in international waters and directed all obstructing vessels to clear the transit lane immediately. No response from the Iranian formation. The 6 vessels held their positions, engines running, navigation lights on, not moving. At 3:17 a.m., the commanding officer transmitted a request to Fifth Fleet for an immediate rules of engagement clarification and for any available air support, with a clear note about the timeline. Less than 3 minutes before a forced response of some kind was unavoidable. Fifth Fleet's clarification came back at 3:19 a.m. The Bainbridge was authorized to use all available means, including physical maneuvering, to maintain innocent passage through the international waters of the strait. Lethal force remained contingent on a demonstrated hostile act. At 3:19 a.m. and 30 seconds, the Bainbridge executed her maneuver. It was not cautious. It was not gradual. It was a deliberate, high-speed, geometrical response to a tactical trap that had been designed to have no comfortable answer. The commanding officer ordered all ahead flank, maximum available speed from the ship's 4 General Electric LM 2500 gas turbine engines, rated at 30 or more knots. Simultaneously, he ordered a 12-degree course change to the south, not enough to enter the shoaling zone, but enough to place the ship on a bearing that would take her through the southernmost gap between the blocking line and the navigable channel boundary. The gap was approximately 400 meters wide, a 155-meter long, 20-meter wide Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, threading a 400-meter gap at 30 knots in complete darkness, requires a helmsman executing continuous, precise corrections at a speed that leaves almost no time to recognize an error before the error becomes a collision. The navigator was calling continuous depth soundings. The executive officer was aft, monitoring channel boundary clearance. The commanding officer was on the bridge wing, watching the southern end of the Iranian blocking line approach at a speed that reduces the visible horizon to seconds of reaction time. The critical moment came at 3:21 a.m. as the Bainbridge was committed to the gap and accelerating through 28 knots. The southernmost Iranian vessel in the blocking line began to drift south, slowly, less than 2 knots of southward speed, but south, closing toward the gap. Whether the drift was deliberate, an instruction to the vessel's commander to tighten the gap if the American destroyer attempted a passage maneuver, or whether the vessel had simply not set its holding position properly and was being moved by the current, was not answerable in the time available. The Bainbridge was committed. The gap was narrowing. The calculation had to be made from what was observable, not from what was knowable. At 28 knots of approach speed, the Bainbridge would complete her transit through the gap in approximately 18 seconds. The Iranian vessel was drifting at less than 2 knots southward. In 18 seconds, it would reduce the gap by approximately 18 meters. The gap started at 400 meters. It would be approximately 382 meters at the moment of the Bainbridge's stern clearance. The Bainbridge's beam is 20 meters. 382 meters of available gap for a 20-meter hull. The math still worked, but it was not the arithmetic anyone on that bridge wanted to be doing at 28 knots in the dark, with a potentially intentionally closing contact on one side and shoaling water on the other. The commanding officer did not reduce speed. At 3:21 a.m. and 40 seconds, the Bainbridge passed through the gap, the closest point of approach to the drifting southern Iranian vessel, 61 meters. At 28 knots of passing speed, the visual impression from both vessels would have been a 9,200-ton warship appearing from the darkness and disappearing into it again in approximately 10 seconds. 61 meters. That is the distance between a clean transit and a collision that would have been the most diplomatically explosive maritime incident in the Persian Gulf in decades. The Bainbridge cleared the blocking line at 3:22 a.m. and resumed her westbound course. She had not been stopped. She had not slowed. She had passed through a deliberately constructed trap at maximum speed with 61 meters of clearance and continued west. Now consider what Fifth Fleet was managing at 3:23 a.m. the moment immediately after the Bainbridge cleared the blocking line. The immediate tactical situation for the Bainbridge herself had been resolved. She was through. But 6 Iranian naval vessels were still sitting in the Strait's deepwater channel, and 34 nautical miles behind the Bainbridge, making 12 knots, was a U.S. military sealift command vessel, a non-combatant cargo ship carrying equipment and materiel for forward-deployed U.S. forces in the region. It would reach the section of the strait where the blocking line sat in approximately 97 minutes. The MSC vessel was not a warship. It did not carry the Bainbridge's propulsion performance, its maneuverability, or its defensive systems. It could not execute a 28-knot gap maneuver. If the Iranian blocking line remained in place, the MSC ship would have to stop. A stopped U.S. military sealift command vessel in the Strait of Hormuz, surrounded by 6 Iranian naval vessels, is not a tactical problem. It is a hostage situation with global economic and diplomatic implications. The Bainbridge's commanding officer understood this without being told. At 3:24 a.m., the Bainbridge altered course, reduced speed to 22 knots, and began a turn that would bring her back eastbound, back toward the blocking line she had just transited through. The effect of that maneuver on the Iranian vessel commanders sitting in the channel would not be subtle. A U.S. destroyer that has just passed through your blocking operation at speed is now turning around and heading back toward you. The message required no radio call to convey. At 3:26 a.m., 2FA-18E, Super Hornets arrived on station overhead. They had been launched from the carrier 22 minutes earlier in response to the Bainbridge's original air support request. Their arrival completed a sequence. First, a destroyer threading the blocking line at 28 knots. Then, the same destroyer turning back east at combat speed. Then, 2 armed Super Hornets descending through the darkness to establish an orbit directly above the 6 Iranian vessels that were still sitting in the international waterway. The Super Hornets descended to 1,500 feet. Slow orbit, conspicuous, unhurried. At 3:28 a.m., the northernmost Iranian vessel in the blocking line began to move north toward the Iranian territorial boundary. The second vessel followed 38 seconds later. The third and fourth vessels moved together at 3:30 a.m. The fifth vessel held its position for an additional 90 seconds, long enough to be notable, not long enough to be a defiant stand. It cleared the channel at 3:31 a.m. The sixth vessel, the one that had drifted south during the Bainbridge's gap transit, was the last to move. It held until 3:34 a.m. before altering course north. At 3:34 a.m., the deepwater channel was clear of Iranian vessels. The Bainbridge resumed her westbound transit at 3:40 a.m., 26 minutes behind her original schedule. The Super Hornets remained on station overhead for an additional 41 minutes, maintaining their visible presence until both the Bainbridge and the MSC vessel behind her had cleared the section of the strait where the blocking operation had occurred. The MSC vessel transited the same stretch of channel at 5:01 a.m. without incident. The post-incident assessment was extensive, and its primary finding was not about the maneuver. It was about the intelligence that had enabled the blocking operation to be positioned as precisely as it had been. The 6 Iranian vessels had not guessed at the deepwater channel geometry. The blocking line had been established at a point where the available gap to the south, the only possible maneuver route, was defined by the shoaling boundary to within approximately 400 meters. That calculation required hydrographic data more precise than publicly available nautical charts provide. Iranian naval planners had access to survey depth data for this section of the strait that was detailed enough to build a blocking operation, calibrated specifically to the draft and beam of the ship they were targeting. This was not a generic blocking operation positioned somewhere in the channel. It was a blocking operation positioned at the one location where the geometry was worst for a gap maneuver attempt and best for forcing a stop. The assessment also addressed the timing of the blocking line establishment. The 6 Iranian vessels had been in their observation pattern for 18 minutes prior to moving to their blocking positions, but they had been tracking the Bainbridge for considerably longer than that. Coastal radar coverage of the western approaches to the strait provided continuous observation capability. The assessment estimated that Iranian planners had had approximately 90 minutes of tracking data on the Bainbridge before executing the blocking deployment, sufficient to calculate the ship's speed and heading with enough precision to position the blocking line at the worst possible point in the Bainbridge's transit corridor. 90 minutes of observation, one blocking line, one 400-meter gap at 28 knots. The operational changes that followed addressed transit pattern predictability, the same finding that had appeared in multiple prior incident assessments in the Gulf, and added specific provisions for maintaining increased separation between combatant and non-combatant vessels in strait transits, to reduce the vulnerability of the non-combatant element to follow on blocking operations, targeting a ship that cannot execute a high-speed gap maneuver. Both changes were operationally sound. Both were responses to a situation that had already happened. In the 6 weeks following the incident, Iranian vessels were observed conducting hydrographic surveys in multiple sections of the strait's transit lanes. Small craft using sonar equipment during periods of reduced commercial traffic. The surveys were monitored and logged. They were not interdicted. Conducting oceanographic surveys in international waters is not a hostile act, but they were building a more detailed map of where the next blocking line could be placed, with even tighter geometry. The Bainbridge had threaded the gap. 61 meters of clearance, 28 knots. No casualties, no damage, no diplomatic incident. But Iran had confirmed that a gap maneuver was the U.S. response to a blocking line. The next blocking line would be designed around that confirmation. Stay sharp, stay informed. This is Navy Strikeforce. We'll see you in the next one.